I can still smell the wood smoke from that morning, the way it mixed with the sharp bite of cold November air that rolled in from the plains. Texas cold is a strange kind. It sneaks up on you. It doesn't come with snow or ice, just this dry, quiet chill that creeps under your skin and stays there. The war had ended months ago, but the air still felt heavy with it. We were in Camp Hearn, one of those places built fast and forgotten faster. Long rows of barracks behind barbed wire, holding the last remnants of an army that no longer existed. German prisoners, boys, mostly. Not the monsters we'd been told about in the training posters, but pale, tired faces that looked too much like ours. Every morning they lined up, worked the fields, fixed fences, did whatever we told them to do, then went back to their side of the wire before sunset. And every evening when I stood guard, I'd catch myself watching them talk, laugh, even play soccer with a ball made of rags. And something in me couldn't decide whether to hate them or to envy them for still being able to laugh at all. Thanksgiving was coming up, though none of us had much to celebrate. We'd lost too many to even keep count properly. Mason, for one, my best friend since boot camp, was buried somewhere in France. They said he went quick, shrapnel to the chest near St. Lo, but I never believed that. Nothing about that place was quick. And now here I was, alive, sitting in a camp surrounded by men who might have pulled the trigger that killed him. When the colonel called us together that morning in the mess hall, his boots echoing against the wooden floor, I wasn't expecting much. Maybe another lecture about discipline, about keeping distance from the prisoners. But what he said made the room go quiet in a way I'll never forget. "This Thursday," he said, "we're inviting the Germans to Thanksgiving dinner." At first we thought he was joking. Then, when we realized he wasn't, the air changed. Someone in the back laughed, more out of disbelief than humor, and the colonel just stared until the sound died. "This war's over," he said, his voice calm but sharp as, "and if we don't start acting, it'll never really end." I remember standing there, staring at the cracks in the floorboard, feeling something twist inside me. He was right maybe, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. The idea of breaking bread with men whose language had become the sound of loss, it felt wrong. It felt like betrayal. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, watching the ceiling fan spin slow circle, the shadows moving like ghosts. I could hear the faint hum of the Germans talking on the other side of the wire, their words soft, rhythmic, almost peaceful. I'd learned enough German to catch a few phrases, talk of home, of mothers, of bread and beer, and songs that had nothing to do with uniforms or orders. And for a moment, it hit me. They were just waiting to go home too. They missed someone too. That realization didn't erase the faces of the dead, but it did something quieter. It made me tired. Tired of carrying hate like a rifle I didn't know how to put down. The next morning, we started preparing. The cooks were already working before sunrise, peeling potatoes, basting turkeys, setting up long wooden tables inside the mess hall. The smell of roasted meat filled the camp, and it did something strange to all of us. It softened the edges. For a few hours, it didn't feel like a military post. It felt like a small town getting ready for a celebration. Some of the men grumbled about it under their breath, but they still helped. You can't stay angry while setting a table, I think. It's too ordinary. When the Germans were led in that afternoon, the camp went still. You could hear the crunch of their boots in the gravel. They walked slow, cautious, their eyes darting around as if expecting a trick. Most of them kept their hands clasped behind their backs. One of them, tall and thin with straw-colored hair and a scar across his chin, nodded politely when he passed me. His uniform was clean but faded, his expression unreadable. I didn't nod back. I couldn't. Not yet. We seated them at the long tables beside us. No segregation, no special section. Just men and plates and the strange weight of silence. The colonel stood at the head and said grace, his hands folded, his voice carrying through the hall with a calm that seemed to still every restless thought in the room. He thanked God for mercy, for life, for the end of killing, and for the strange opportunity to share a meal, not as enemies, but as men who have both survived the same storm. When we raised our heads, something in the room shifted. Someone laughed, quietly at first, then louder. One of our guys passed a bowl of mashed potatoes across the table, and a German soldier said, "Danke," with a shy half-smile. Someone else poured gravy. Another passed bread. The sound of cutlery scraping against metal plates filled the space, joined by the murmur of voices, English and German mixing in an awkward but honest way. The tension bled out slowly, replaced by something almost fragile, warmth. I found myself sitting across from the tall German with the scar. His name was Otto. He said he used to work in a bakery before the war, in a small town near Bremen. I asked him what kind of bread he made, and he smiled like the question pulled him out of some dark hole. Rye bread, he said. My mother's recipe. Then, almost shyly, he asked if I had family back home. I told him about my mother in Kansas, about her pies, her way of making too much food for anyone who came through the door. He laughed softly and said that sounded like his own mother. We didn't talk about the war. We didn't need to. When I looked around that hall, it didn't look like soldiers and prisoners anymore. It looked like a bunch of tired men trying to remember what it felt like to be human again. And maybe that's what the Colonel wanted us to see all along, that mercy isn't weakness. It's proof that the war didn't win. Tell me where you're watching this from. I'd love to know how far this story traveled. That night after the dinner, I stayed behind to help clean up. The mess hall was quiet, except for the soft clatter of dishes and the faint murmur of voices drifting in from outside. The Germans had gone back to their barracks, and my fellow guards had already started joking about the meal, pretending it was no big deal. But I could feel something different in the air, something that didn't fit into the usual rhythm of camp life. It was like the place had exhaled for the first time in months. The tension, that constant invisible hum that followed us everywhere since the war began, seemed to have faded, leaving behind a silence that wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm. I sat for a while at one of the long tables, my hands resting on the wood still warm from the lanterns, staring at the crumbs and empty plates scattered like quiet witnesses. I thought about Otto, the baker from Bremen, and the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his mother's bread. That small spark of life in him, something familiar, human, had left a mark on me I couldn't quite shake off. The next morning, the camp felt different. The guards weren't barking orders as loud, and the prisoners seemed less stiff in their movements. I noticed one of them humming a tune while working near the tool shed, and one of our boys, Sanders, actually whistled along. You'd think that was nothing, just noise between two men, but in that place, it was a miracle. A few weeks earlier, the same man wouldn't have even looked at a prisoner without scowling. I remember thinking how strange it was that a single shared meal could shift something that months of orders and regulations never did. Maybe that's what peace looks like, not a treaty or a handshake, but a few moments where people stop seeing uniforms and start seeing faces. That evening, I went on guard duty near the fence. The sun was setting behind the fields, painting the sky orange and violet, and the light caught on the barbed wire, making it shimmer like 1,000 tiny stars. Otto was sitting just inside the enclosure, sketching something in a small notebook. He looked up, saw me, and hesitated before holding it up so I could see. It was a drawing of the mess hall, simple but beautiful. The tables, the lanterns, the faces. He'd even drawn me, sitting across from him, my hand on a cup of coffee. I didn't know what to say. He must have seen it on my face because he gave a small nod and said, "For memory." That hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. The idea that this man, this former enemy, wanted to remember that day, that moment of peace, when so much else was worth forgetting. I gave him a nod back. For the first time, it felt easy. Later that week, I got a letter from home. My mother's handwriting, neat, looping, always careful, talked about the harvest, the church choir, and how she was setting an extra plate for me at Thanksgiving, even though she knew I couldn't be there. She said the neighbor's boy had come home from Europe, missing a leg but smiling anyway, and that the town had thrown him a parade. I read that part 3 times, trying to imagine what that must have felt like, being home, being celebrated, being alive without guilt attached to it. I folded the letter and put it in my breast pocket, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel that sharp sting of envy, just a quiet hope that maybe someday I'd find my way back to that kind of peace too. A few days after Thanksgiving, the colonel made his rounds, inspecting the camp as usual, but this time he stopped to talk, not bark, not lecture, just talk. He asked if I'd noticed anything different after the dinner. I told him I had. He nodded slowly, like he already knew. "Mercy changes things," he said. "Not for them, for us." Then he turned and walked away, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. I stood there a long time after he left, letting that sink in. I'd spent years thinking strength came from hardness, from shutting down every feeling that got in the way of doing your job. But the colonel was right. That night, when I saw those German prisoners eat and laugh and breathe like men again, I didn't feel weak. I felt lighter. The war had taken so much from all of us. Friends, innocence, trust. But sitting there that night, I realized it hadn't taken everything. It couldn't touch moments like that. Moments where the line between enemy and human blurred just enough for compassion to slip through. The next time I saw Otto, I asked him about his family again. He told me his father had been a soldier too. killed in Russia in '43. His voice didn't carry pride when he said it, just a kind of tired sorrow. I told him about Mason, about how we'd promised to start a small repair shop together after the war, maybe even move west. He listened in silence, his pencil still in his hand, and when I finished, he said something I didn't expect. Maybe they meet in heaven. Fix airplane. We both laughed, but it wasn't just laughter. It was a small kind of healing. I didn't know it then, but that Thanksgiving would stay with me longer than any battle. It was a quiet victory, one without medals or headline, but maybe that's the only kind that matters in the end, because it reminded me that wars don't just end when the shooting stops. They end when men find the courage to forgive. If you're feeling something while listening to this, maybe that quiet mix of sorrow and warmth, go ahead and hit subscribe. This channel is full of stories like this, real moments of humanity buried in the noise of war, and I'd love for you to walk through them with me. It was early December when the peace of the camp began to crack. The weather turned unpredictable, cold one morning, humid the next, and the air carried that strange stillness that always made me uneasy, the kind that feels like a warning. The days after Thanksgiving had gone smoother than anyone expected. The guards and prisoners coexisted without the tightness that used to hang over everything. There was even a rumor going around that the army might start transferring some of the Germans back home by spring, and you could see it in their faces, that fragile hope, that quiet anticipation of life beyond the wire. But peace, I've learned, doesn't last easy for men who've been trained to survive on tension. The silence after war can be louder than gunfire if you sit in it too long. One morning, before sunrise, I was making my rounds when I noticed two of the perimeter lights had gone out near the east fence. It wasn't unusual. The wiring in that part of the camp was old, and the windstorms had been rough, but something about it didn't feel right. I walked the line slowly, hand resting on my rifle, boots sinking into damp soil. When I reached the fence, I saw a fresh break in the dirt, footprints, two sets, heading out toward the open fields beyond. My stomach dropped. We hadn't had an escape attempt in months, and I'd started to believe maybe we never would again. I crouched down, touching the edge of one print. It was shallow, recent. Whoever it was hadn't gotten far. By the time I sounded the alarm, the whole camp was stirring. Searchlights swung across the darkness, slicing through the fog that had settled low over the ground. The dogs barked, their howls cutting through the night, and soldiers grabbed rifles and fanned out in teams. The colonel arrived minutes later, calm as always, but with that hard look in his eye, the one that told you this was serious. 2 missing, he said. We tracked them down. Bring them back alive if possible. Dead if necessary. The words hit me harder than I expected. Alive if possible. Dead if necessary. It felt like stepping backward in time, back into that world of kill or be killed that I thought we'd left behind. We moved through the brush in a long line, the cold air biting our cheeks, boots crunching on frozen grass. The sun hadn't risen yet, but a pale grey light was starting to creep over the horizon. I could see my breath, white and thin, floating ahead of me. The man beside me, Sanders, was breathing hard, muttering curses under his breath. Should have known, he said. You give 'em a damn turkey dinner. They'll start thinking they're free. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure he was wrong. We found the first one around an hour later. He was huddled in a dry creek bed, his hands shaking from the cold, his face pale with fear. When the light hit him, he froze, then raised his hands. Bitter, bitter, he stammered, the word trembling out of him like it had been torn loose. He couldn't have been more than 19. The boy's name was Emil, and he was crying before anyone even touched him. The colonel's men cuffed him and took him back without a word, but there was still one more missing. We pushed on through the brush, my boots heavy with mud, heart thudding in my chest. The further we went, the less it felt like a manhunt, and the more it felt like something personal. I don't know why I cared so much about who it was, or why he ran, but some part of me, maybe that same part that hadn't stopped thinking about Otto's sketch, wanted to believe it wasn't him. I kept scanning the trees, the field, the tracks. The prints led toward the tree line, up a small hill, where the fog grew thicker, curling around the trunks like smoke. And then, there he was, Otto. He was standing by an old fence post, hands gripping the wire, staring out at the open plain like he could already see the ship that would take him home. He didn't run when he saw me. He just turned slowly, his face calm, almost sad. For a moment, we just looked at each other. No words, no orders, just that strange understanding that two men can have when both know something's about to end. I raised my rifle, not out of anger or duty, but because that was what training did. It moved your body before your heart could argue. Why? I asked. My voice came out rough, too loud in the quiet. You were weeks away from going home. He hesitated, his breath visible in the cold air. I heard my brother is alive, he said in broken English. In Louisiana, prisoner also. I go to find him. His voice cracked, and for a moment I could see the desperation behind his calm face. He wasn't running to escape punishment or to fight again. He was running for family, for a piece of himself that war hadn't taken yet. Behind me, I heard the other men approaching, Sanders and two more. He's here! Sanders shouted. The spell broke. Otto's eyes widened just slightly, and he stepped back from the fence. Don't, I said, raising a hand. Don't move! But instinct is faster than words. Sanders raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the fog like a thunderclap. Otto jerked, stumbled back, and fell against the wire. For a second, everything went still. Then the world came rushing in. The shouts, the running, the dogs barking again in the distance. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was kneeling beside him, my hands pressing against the wound in his chest. The blood came fast, dark and warm against my palms. He tried to speak, his lips moving soundlessly at first, then forming one word. Danke, his eyes fixed on mine, clear and unblinking, and in them I saw not fear, but something else, acceptance, maybe even peace. Then he was gone. We carried him back to camp, wrapped in a blanket. No one spoke. Sanders kept glancing at me, maybe expecting me to say something, to justify it, but I didn't have words. The colonel met us at the gate, his jaw tight, his eyes heavy. Unfortunate, he said quietly. But it couldn't be helped. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that maybe it could have been helped, but the words wouldn't come, because the truth is, I wasn't sure anymore where duty ended and mercy began. That night, I sat on my bunk staring at the sketch Otto had given me. The lines of the mess hall, the faces, the tiny flicker of joy he'd managed to capture. It all looked so fragile now. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my jacket pocket, next to my mother's letter. I couldn't stop thinking about how close he'd been to freedom. A few more months, maybe less. But war doesn't know mercy's timing. It always takes before it gives. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tin roof. I lay awake listening to it, and for the first time in years, I felt tears run down my face. Not for the men we lost in battle, not for the friends buried overseas, but for a German baker named Otto, who just wanted to see his brother again. The days after Otto's death felt heavier than any battlefield I'd ever stood on. Not because of noise or chaos, but because of the silence that followed. It was the kind of silence that crept under the skin, stayed in the corners of your thoughts, and whispered when everything else went still. The camp went back to its routines, but something had cracked. The men spoke less. Even the prisoners, usually murmuring among themselves during work detail, seemed to move slower, quieter, like they'd felt the shift too. It's strange how quickly grief spreads, even across fences. You'd think it would stay divided like everything else in that place. American on one side, German on the other. But pain doesn't respect sides. It seeps through the wire like fog. The colonel ordered the burial to be simple. No ceremony, no flag, just a wooden cross by the small patch of ground behind the storage shed where we buried the others who hadn't made it. The official report called it an escape attempt neutralized. Clean words, dry as paper. I stood there as they lowered the body into the dirt, the late afternoon sun hitting the field just enough to turn the air gold. Sanders was beside me, staring at the ground, jaw tight. I wanted to say something, to him, to anyone, but the words felt too small for the moment. I just kept seeing Otto's face in my head, that quiet look before the shot, the faint trace of understanding in his eyes. When the dirt hit the wood, the sound echoed in my chest like a final heartbeat. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air inside the barracks was thick, filled with the smell of oil and sweat, and the faint tang of burned coffee from the pot that never seemed to empty. I lay on my bunk staring at the sketch he'd given me, the one of the mess hall, now smudged and creased from the way I'd folded it. My hands trembled when I held it up to the light. It felt wrong that something so gentle, so human, could outlive the man who made it. I thought about how he'd drawn me into it, how his pencil had captured that moment of stillness between us, that small miracle. I wondered if he'd known somehow that it wouldn't last. Maybe he'd drawn it because he wanted proof that it had ever been real. The next morning, I was assigned to the watchtower near the west perimeter, the one facing the open fields. From up there, the world looked too big and too empty all at once. I could see miles of flat land stretching to the horizon, the faint shimmer of heat rising even in winter, and sometimes, if the wind carried right, I could hear the faint notes of the Germans singing during work detail. They sang quietly now, songs that didn't sound like marches or war hymns, but like prayers. I didn't understand the words, but I didn't need to. Grief speaks its own language. A few days later, something unexpected happened. One of the prisoners, an older man named Richter, approached the gate with a folded piece of paper and he asked to speak to the colonel. When they brought him to the office, I was standing guard outside. I could hear fragments through the door, his voice steady, respectful, though weighted with something deep. He said the men wanted to hold a small service for Otto, just prayers, nothing more. The colonel didn't answer at first. There was the scrape of a chair, the sound of pacing. Then, finally, he said, 1 hour, no gatherings larger than 20. Richter thanked him quietly, and when he stepped out, he looked at me, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something softer, gratitude maybe, or understanding. I wasn't sure which hurt more. That evening, I watched from a distance as the Germans gathered by the fence. They stood in a semicircle, the setting sun catching the edges of their faces, and one of them began to speak in German, slow, solemn, almost like chanting. Then another began to hum, low at first, then joined by others, until the air filled with a sound that made my chest tighten. It wasn't the song itself, it was the way it carried through the air, how it filled the empty space left by all we'd lost. Even some of our men stopped to listen. No one spoke. When the song ended, the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something raw and honest. That night, Sanders found me sitting outside the barracks, cigarette burning between my fingers. He hadn't said much since the day of the shooting, but he sat down beside me without a word. The air was cold, the kind that makes breath visible, and for a while, we just stared at the ground. You think he'd have made it? He finally asked. I knew who he meant. Otto. No, I said, though my voice wavered. But maybe that's not the point. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. I didn't mean to. He started, but stopped. His voice broke. I'd never seen him like that. The tough kid from Chicago who never blinked under fire, now looking like a boy who'd lost something he couldn't name. I didn't say it was okay. It wasn't. But I put a hand on his shoulder anyway. Sometimes silence is the only forgiveness we can give. Days turned into... The Christmas season crept closer, though it didn't feel like any holiday I'd ever known. The camp was still and cold, the fences dusted with frost in the early morning. Some of the men started carving small gifts, wooden toys, little trinkets, to send home or to trade with the prisoners for handmade things. One afternoon, I found a small box outside the mess hall door. Inside was a loaf of dark rye bread, wrapped in cloth. No note, just the bread. The smell of it, rich, earthy, brought me back to that dinner table, to Otto's smile when he talked about his mother's baking. I didn't tell anyone about the gift. I cut a small piece, ate it slowly, and buried the rest behind the shed where he was buried. It felt like the only thing left I could give him. By the end of December, something in me had shifted for good. I still wore the uniform, still carried the rifle, still did my duty. But the way I looked at the world had changed. The enemy wasn't a face anymore. It was an idea. And ideas, I realized, are what keep wars alive long after the shooting stops. When I think back on those days, it's not the battles that haunt me. It's the quiet moments, the sound of a man's voice saying Danke as he dies, the hum of a song sung by prisoners under a setting sun, the smell of bread left at a door by someone who just wanted to be seen as human. Those are the things that stay. Tell me, have you ever forgiven someone who hurt you, even when part of you didn't want to? Write it down in the comments with this line so I can find you. I chose mercy, even when it hurt. Winter lingered longer than it should have that year. The air stayed cold and dry, the kind of cold that didn't sting but clung to everything. Your clothes, your breath, your thoughts. The war felt like a distant thing by then, something that belonged to another life. But even with the fences and guards and uniforms, the camp didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a waiting room between two worlds, the one we'd left behind and the one we still didn't know how to live in. I started spending more time by the west fence where Otto had fallen, not because I wanted to mourn, but because the place had become something quiet, sacred, in a way that had nothing to do with religion. Sometimes I'd just stand there, watching the horizon, the way the light bent across the frost. Sometimes 1 or 2 prisoners would pass nearby, working the field, and we'd exchange nods. Nothing more, but it felt like enough. One morning, while walking the perimeter, I noticed Richter, the older prisoner who'd led the memorial service, kneeling by the small cross that marked Otto's grave. He wasn't praying, he was writing something in a small notebook. When he saw me, he stood quickly, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said in careful English. I write his name so he is not forgotten. His words hit me harder than I expected. I told him he didn't have to apologize. He nodded, hesitated, then said, "You knew him?" I said yes, and for a moment we just stood there, Two soldiers on opposite sides of a line that no longer meant much. Then he said something that stayed with me ever since. In war, the good men die twice, first by bullet, then by memory. I didn't know how to answer. He tucked the notebook into his coat and walked away, leaving me alone with the wind. That night, I wrote a letter home. I told my mother about the camp, about the prisoners, about the Thanksgiving dinner. Though I didn't mention Otto by name, I told her that sometimes peace doesn't come with parades or medals. It comes with a strange kind of quiet that makes you face yourself. I told her I was learning that mercy wasn't weakness, that sometimes it took more courage to forgive than to fight. When I finished writing, I just sat there holding the pen, staring at the paper. I realized I wasn't really writing to her. I was writing to myself, trying to make sense of what all this meant, trying to build something human out of everything that had been torn apart. The days passed slower on. The work details, the head counts, the endless rhythm of routine, it all blurred together. But there was something gentler in the air, something that reminded me of the way dawn feels after a storm. The guards had stopped treating the prisoners like shadows, and the prisoners, in turn, stopped carrying themselves like ghosts. One afternoon, I watched a group of them fixing the fence. They laughed about something, one of them wiping his hands on his pants, and it struck me how normal it looked, how much it resembled any group of men doing a job together. For a second, if you squinted, you could almost forget the war ever happened. Then Christmas came. The colonel allowed us a small celebration, nothing grand, just a few decorations. Some carols played on a scratched record, a special dinner with coffee that wasn't watered down for one. Later that evening, a few of the prisoners were permitted to sing. They stood by the wire, voices low but clear, singing Stille Nacht. The melody drifted across the camp like smoke, soft and haunting. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that song, but it was the first time it made me want to close my eyes and listen instead of turning away. The sound carried through the cold air, and for a moment, the fences disappeared. Just men, just voices, remembering home. Afterward, I walked alone toward the west side of the camp. The stars were sharp and bright, the sky deep and endless. I stood by Otto's grave again, the wind tugging at my coat. I thought about Mason, about all the men I'd fought beside who didn't make it home. I thought about the faces of the Germans who sat at that Thanksgiving table, the fear, the relief, the fragile hope. And I realized something I'd never put into words before. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's the only way you save yourself from becoming the thing you hate. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I took off my glove, reached down, and pressed my hand against the cold wood of the cross. The grain was rough, splintered, but solid. I whispered, I remember, though I don't know if I was talking to Otto, to Mason, or to the part of myself that was still at war. Maybe all of them, maybe it doesn't matter. When I returned to the barracks, someone had left another small loaf of bread on my bunk, wrapped neatly in cloth. This one had a note tucked beneath it, just a few words, written in shaky English, for peace between men. I didn't know who left it, and I didn't try to find out. I tore it in half, shared it with Sanders, and for a moment, we ate in silence. No words, no toasts, just understanding. That winter taught me more about being a man than the war ever did. The war showed me how to survive, but that place, that quiet camp in Texas, showed me how to live again. The year turned, and with it came news that the prisoners would soon be repatriated. The orders came down quietly one morning in February. Like everything else in the army, no ceremony, no build-up, just a typed notice pinned to the bulletin. I remember standing there with a cup of black coffee gone cold, staring at the paper as the words settled into me. Most of the men cheered when they read it. It meant change, movement, something new after months of stillness. But for me, it felt more complicated than that. The camp had become a kind of strange sanctuary. Haunted, yes, but familiar. The idea of it emptying out left me with a weight I didn't know how to name. In the weeks that followed, the Germans began preparing to leave. You could see it in the way they carried themselves. Straighter, lighter, their eyes filled with something almost childlike. They cleaned their barracks with a care that surprised me, sweeping every corner, folding their blankets, mending torn clothes. They even built small wooden boxes to carry the few belongings they had. Every day, more trucks came, loading groups of them for transport. The air buzzed with mixed emotions, joy, relief, and something else, something quieter, like sorrow wearing a disguise. Even Sanders, who had never trusted them, walked slower those days, like he didn't quite know what to do with himself without someone to guard. One morning, Richter approached me again. He looked older than I remembered, lines deeper around his eyes, but there was peace there too. He handed me a small envelope. "For you," he said. I opened it and found a folded piece of paper, a sketch. It was of the west fence, the wide field beyond it, and the faint outline of two men standing side by side, one in uniform, one in prisoner's clothes. Beneath it, written in German, were 4 words: Frieden ist gelernt, nicht gegeben. Peace is learned, not given. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until I read it. I looked up, but he was already walking away toward the trucks, his head held high. The morning the last group left, the camp felt unreal. The fences, the guard towers, even the barracks seemed to lose their meaning without the people who gave them purpose. When the trucks rolled out, I stood by the gate, watching them disappear into the horizon. Some of the prisoners waved. I lifted my hand in return, not out of duty, but out of something deeper, gratitude or closure. As the dust settled, I turned toward the empty compound. It looked larger now, almost endless, but also hollow, like a stage after the curtain. I walked through it one last time, the mess hall, the yard, the path to the west fence. When I reached the small cross where Otto was buried, the wind was still, and the world felt pause. I knelt, brushing the dirt off the wood. Someone had left a small carving there, a bird, wings open. I didn't touch it. I just watched the way the light hit it, the way it seemed ready to fly. That night, I sat outside the barracks alone. The sky was clear, stars bright enough to make you forget how dark the world had been. I thought about all the faces, Mason, Otto, Richter, the Colonel, Sanders, and how each of them had taught me something about what it means to carry both pain and grace in the same breath. I realized the war had never really been about who was right or wrong. It was about how much of our humanity we could keep from being stripped away. Some men lost theirs in battle. Others found it, strangely, in places like this, in a shared meal, a quiet word, a single act of mercy that no one would ever write about. When the orders finally came for me to go home, I packed light. My duffel held a few clothes, my mother's letters, Otto's sketch, and the drawing Richter had given me. Nothing else felt worth taking. Before I left, I walked the perimeter one last time. The camp was empty, silent except for the creak of metal gates in the wind. I stopped by the west fence, looked out toward the open land, and felt something ease inside me, something I'd been carrying since Normandy. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was the beginning of it, the kind that takes years to finish, maybe a lifetime. As I turned to leave, I thought about something the Colonel said months earlier, the night he announced that Thanksgiving dinner. It's time we remember who we are. Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was talking about duty or honor, or maybe pride, but standing there with the night stretching wide before me, I realized he meant something much simpler. He meant that even after everything, after blood and hate and orders, we were still capable of choosing kindness. That's what makes us who we are. I got home in early spring, when the fields in Kansas were starting to come alive again. The bus dropped me off near the old post office, and from there I walked the rest of the way with my duffel over my shoulder, boots kicking up dust from the same road I'd walked down the day I left for basic training. The air smelled of soil and grass, and somewhere far off, I heard the faint sound of a church bell. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The houses, the trees, even the horizon. Or maybe it was me who'd grown too big for it, carrying ghosts that wouldn't fit anywhere. When I reached the porch, my mother was already standing there. She didn't cry, not right away. She just reached out, touched my face, and said, "You're home." It was the gentlest sentence I'd ever heard. For a long time, we didn't talk about the war. She asked questions, but I didn't know how to answer them. How do you explain to someone who's never heard a man die what it means to live after? How do you tell them that mercy can hurt more than violence? So instead, I helped around the farm, fixed the fence, painted the barn, slept with the window open to let the night air in, even though sometimes it brought dreams I'd rather keep buried. But slowly, the quiet began to do its work. Each sunrise, each meal, each small piece of normal life stitched me back together in ways I hadn't realized I'd been torn apart. A few months later, a letter arrived from the army. Inside was a note from the Colonel, typed but personal, thanking me for my service and enclosing a small packet. When I opened it, I found a photograph, the Thanksgiving dinner. I didn't even know one had been taken. The table stretched out under the glow of lanterns, faces blurred in laughter and motion, Germans and Americans sitting side by side. At the center, barely visible, was Otto, his head turned slightly, a half smile frozen in the moment. The sight of it made me sit down hard in the kitchen chair, breath catching in my throat. I stared at that photograph for a long time, tracing the edges with my fingers. It was proof that what we'd done there, what we'd shared, had been real. That mercy wasn't just an idea. It was something that had happened once, in a small camp in Texas. Years went by. I married, raised 2 children, worked as a mechanic. Life became steady, predictable, the way I'd always hoped it would. But every Thanksgiving, without fail, I'd set an extra plate at the table. My wife used to ask why, and I'd just say, for the ones who didn't make it home. I never explained further. But in truth, that plate wasn't just for the dead. It was for the living too. For Otto, for Richter, for Mason, for every man who'd ever looked across a line and seen himself in the eyes of his enemy. Now, when I look back, I don't think about the uniforms or the battles or the medals that turned to rust in drawers. I think about that single night in 1945 when we stopped being soldiers for a few hours and became something simpler. Men, hungry, tired, human. I think about the way laughter sounded against tin walls, how the smell of roasted turkey cut through the memory of smoke and blood, how a German baker and an American farm boy found a sliver of peace in a war that tried to take everything from them. That's the story that matters. So if you're watching this now, wherever you are, if you've ever carried the weight of something you can't forgive or someone you can't forget, remember this: peace isn't handed to us. It's made, one act of kindness at a time. You don't have to change the world. Just share your table, your bread, your story. That's where it begins. And if this story touched something in you, if you felt that small spark of warmth in the middle of the cold, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Not for me, but for the memories we keep alive by telling them. Because stories like these are all we have to remind us that even after the worst of wars, mercy still wins.